The state of war is only intensifying by the day, specifically in and around the eastern Ukrainian city of Bakhmut. One Ukrainian unit says it has made more progress on the western outskirts of the city. Ukrainian forces have claimed advancements in several areas surrounding the embattled eastern city in recent days, despite coming under heavy fire from Russian troops. Now, the much talked about counteroffensive planned by Ukraine is finally taking shape, but it seems tough to understand given the confusing plan and execution of this counteroffensive. Analysts claim that Ukraine meant it that way. There are columns of dozens of US-supplied ambush vehicles preceded by police cars, blaring lights tailed by dozens of muddy civilian saloons. Where the armored vehicles were ultimately destined for is still unclear. But they were still, a paint job. They would have had for use in Iraq and Afghanistan as well. Nobody knows. That also goes on to suggest that they were at least a spray can or mud shower away from being ready for use on the front line. That means Western defense assistance is beginning to arrive. Given the volume of US and NATO hardware, advice and training has been poured into this operation. It is possible we only learn the counteroffensive has begun when its first tangible results are revealed. A lot of what is happening is perhaps not playing out in public. How much weight does that have? In fact have? Let me bring in my guests today. I'm joined in by Fred Ware, who's a senior journalist and joining me live from Moscow. I'm also joined in by Bishop Garrison, who's an adjunct professor from Georgetown University School of Foreign Service. Thank you so much, Bishop and Fred, for joining in. Bishop, if I may begin with you, is the delay in declaring the start of the assault a mindful tactic on Ukraine's part?
Well, thank you for having me. Well, as you laid out, I think quite concisely, there are a few things that we don't fully have the information on or are aware of. Some of this may very well be purposeful. It's very important for Ukraine to have operational security in terms of how the flow of information actually moves. We know that they're very much aware of the leaks that happened here in the United States. Some of that information that was leaked did deal directly with information pertaining to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So that plays a part into it. They have said that they're not going to share or at least limit their share of some of their intelligence information with Western governments because of that. So that plays at least some role into it. Another part is the dysfunction and lack of unity we've seen with Russian forces throughout the entire campaign here within the invasion of Ukraine. They can take this as an opportunity and use this information as to their advantage, that they continue to have feints and misdirections that allow them to keep their enemy guessing about what may happen next and what comes along.
Right. Fred, while weighing in on what Bishop has had to say, does it seem like a well thought out strategy, or is it just Ukrainian chaos and a relatively wet April leaving the ground too soft?
I don't think well thought out strategy describes any phase of this war so far on either side. But we definitely do see an intensification of fighting. We see massive Russian missile bombardments in the past week or so all over Ukraine. They've hit some targets. They've had a lot of their missiles shot down, but it's definitely an intensification in that area. In Bakhmut, the fighting is ferocious. Around the flanks, the Ukrainians are apparently making some gains, but in the city itself, the Wagner forces, it's mainly this mercenary group of Russians, seem to have pretty much completed taking the town. There's maybe a couple of rows of high buildings left on the western outskirts of the town. So, but none of this adds up to the big counteroffensive that we're being primed to expect on either side. This is still jockeying for position, I think, and if there's a big blow to come, as you said, and your other speaker said, it's hidden so far. We do not see the fist being prepared or in what direction or when it's going to hit. So we're still essentially waiting.
Bishop, how do you weigh in on what Fred is saying? Because he does make a point, because, you know, we've been hearing of reports which are talking about a counteroffensive about to happen, and the magnitude of that is not really seen so far. But as I said in the beginning, a lot that's happening in Ukraine is perhaps not playing out in public. That is also what is evident from the recent assaults around Bakhmut. What's made Ukraine's air defenses so impenetrable all of a sudden?
Well, a part of it is the utilization of Patriot missile systems, but
yeah, and as we speak, in fact, there's been a 9th air attack on Kyiv today.
Yeah, yes, and saw the information on that, and to the other panelists' point, like again, we don't know what we don't know, as you mentioned at the beginning of this. We don't know all of the information is being shared. A lot of this is going to be classified with regards to for operational security purposes. As more of this comes out, you often do have a very strategic plan on how an operation and how warfare is going to turn out, and then the first bomb is dropped and the first rifle is fired, and that plan could go completely kaput. So we're seeing a lot of this in real time, where we were expecting much more of a heavy fighting across the board. We're seeing that in some areas like Bakhmut and other regions. But ultimately, this, to some degree, is about the disunity that you see within Russian forces, and Ukraine having potentially an opportunity to kind of mask its own operations and to keep the Russians guessing long enough for it to properly place itself for more success in some of these regions.
Right.
But honestly, we don't know. We're going to have to see how
True.
some of this plays out in real time.
Yes, we have to see how it plays out. But Fred, as we've been discussing for quite some time about how this has been a war of attrition, and so is such a warfare, could this confusion over Ukraine's counter-offensive be advantageous in such a warfare tactic as far as a battle of attrition is concerned?
Well, the Russians have clearly taken that decision last fall after their major setbacks to dig in most places, prepare defenses, prepare to absorb the Ukrainian attacks. In Bakhmut, they've adopted a different tactic. That is, it's mainly the Wagner forces moving forward grindingly, and at clearly enormous costs on both sides. I mean, I even what we get to hear about the figures of people being killed and wounded and coming out of there, it's just monstrous. So I don't know. I think that the disunity on the Russian side is exaggerated. I know we've seen the videos of Yevgeny Prigozhin complaining and demonstrating his contempt for the military leadership, which is undoubtedly genuine. But he doesn't follow through on his threats to leave. And the front line there does seem to have stabilized to a great degree. So I wouldn't count on Russian dysfunction or disunity this time around. When the offensive comes, I think they're pretty much ready for it.
It's interesting you spoke about Prigozhin, because I'd like to take my next two questions on Wagner. Bishop, does Wagner's dwindling position have a role in Ukraine's battleground gains, apart from the defense assistance from Ukraine's allies, of course?
Well, I think my colleague made a very strong point here. And one thing I'd like to add to some of his words regarding that is that we have to keep in mind, too, that Russian military leadership took heavy losses, particularly early on during this warfare, losing many generals in terms of attrition and losses. So that plays a role into this, as well as potentially Wagner. We know that they have engaged in countless heinous acts and have been at odds with a lot of Russian leadership throughout this, and we speak about how their leadership has been very vocal, but has yet to actually act on some of these comments that they have made. So
right.
I think all of these play into some of the levels of dysfunction that we have seen. But to that point, it's going to take more action from Wagner in terms of that dysfunction for any of it to actually matter at the end of the day. If they're
Right.
continuing to fight as they have been fighting in the region, if they're continuing with the same veracity and the same lethality, then it's going to put Ukraine in a difficult defensive position.
No, it certainly will. And taking a cue from what you just said as far as taking action towards Wagner is concerned, I'd like Fred's closing thoughts on this question. Fred, despite the scathing public criticism of the Kremlin, what explains Wagner chief Prigozhin's remarkable survival? Because this is unimaginable to have seen a man go all guns blazing against the Kremlin and the president and yet be out there on the battlefield.
First of all, his survival partly depends on him not criticizing the Kremlin, and he hasn't. People parse his remarks and think he may be talking about Putin or something in some of the things he says, but it's not.
No, but it's there on video. It's there on video when he's shown those martyred soldiers.
It's the defense ministry, the military bureaucracy that he lambastes.
Okay.
And he, so far, has the protection of Putin. And that may not last. It certainly wouldn't last if he did turn his rhetorical guns on Putin. But he doesn't. He's playing a smart game, and he's jockeying for position, I think, in post-war Russia. I think he wants to be somebody in Russia's oligarchic lineup. He wants to have his private army somehow enshrined as an official part of Russia. But he isn't openly challenging the Kremlin. People get that wrong.
All right.
Although stirring things up, and he is creating an awful lot of resentment and anger in the defense ministry. But so far, he has Putin's backing, and he is getting his way. And his forces are the only ones that are visibly moving forward of Russian forces. They are pretty much in possession of about 99% of Bakhmut.
All right.
As we.
No, thank you so much, Fred. In fact, that's an interesting angle that you've added, something that's been quite eye-opening. Many thanks to you, Fred and Bishop, for joining in with your very valuable inputs. Thoroughly appreciate your time.